Today's accelerating inflation rate proves that after 8 years, this Prime Minister is just not worth the cost.
We've demonstrated that we were able to bring down inflation from the highs of 8.1%, while at the same time being there to invest in Canadians.
How many Canadians will go bankrupt, and will we have a mortgage crisis?
We know Canadians are struggling right now.
Why should Canadians trust this could have, should have Prime Minister now?
We've said clearly that we expect to see a concrete plan from those grocery CEOs, and if they don't come forward with strong enough measures, then we will take measures.
Leaders there in the House of Commons sparring on the cost of living crunch today as Statistics Canada reports inflation spiked up to 4% in August. That's compared to a 3.3% rate of inflation in July. The rise, according to StatsCan, is driven primarily by high gas prices and fueling pressure for relief. But political parties are divided on how to provide that relief. With me now to talk about just that, Conservative House Leader Andrew Scheer and Treasury Board Parliamentary Secretary Greg Fergus. Hi to both of you. Thank you very much for making the time for the discussion. Mr. Fergus, I'm going to start with you and actually pick up exactly where the Prime Minister left off there. Could you offer Canadians listening tonight some clarity on what exactly grocery store CEOs agreed to? And by that I mean, when Canadians go to the grocery store on Thanksgiving, the deadline that your government has spoken about, will there actually be lower prices for them there?
Well, first of all, let me just first say we recognize how difficult times are for Canadians dealing with the global inflation that's happening. In Canada, we're fortunate, relatively fortunate, in the sense that our global inflation rate is lower than it is in other countries, but nonetheless, it's still too high, and it's really hurting Canadians, and we recognize that. What the Prime Minister has done in terms of convening this meeting with the big 5 grocery chains is that the Minister of Innovation had a meeting with them. They've all agreed that they need to stabilize grocery prices, to making sure that it's not running above the regular or the average inflation rate, and to bring those prices down in line with what Canadians can deal with. Having to have fueling prices go higher, or to have the food prices go higher, it doesn't help anyone. It makes things tougher for their clients, and it makes things tougher for Canadians.
Can you explain, though, specifically what that means? Because I understand the word stabilize and bring in line with inflation. Does that, for example, mean food prices for August were at a rate of 6.9% higher than they were a year before? Overall inflation is at 4%. Does that mean prices will go down by 3%? What does stabilization mean? Like, I'm just trying to get at whether or not this is your government talking about it without actually delivering.
No, very much so. I think the question is that we want to make sure that we're doing the right thing for Canadians, and making sure that prices are going to be brought in line with what it is, the average inflation rate. It doesn't make sense.
4% increase instead of 7%.
Well, that's exactly what we're trying to get to.
And have they agreed to that, the grocery stores?
Well, they've all agreed that they need to do a better job in making sure that the prices aren't running off, because we're seeing inputs going in at a certain rate. So let's say different cost which goes into the production is being outpaced by the actual price that Canadians are paying at the cashier. So those are the things that we got to work on.
Do you agree with that statement, Mr. Scheer? And is your party supportive of efforts to force grocers to bring, as Mr. Fergus just outlined, their prices in line with the overall rate of inflation?
Well, there's so many things wrong with what Craig just said. Inflation's not a global phenomenon. It's a made-in-Canada situation because of Justin Trudeau's inflationary deficits. Over the last few years, the Bank of Canada purchased government bonds, allowing Justin Trudeau to spend, and all that money washed through the economy, and more dollars chasing fewer goods lead to higher prices. So this idea that inflation is kind of like the weather and it just kind of happens and we have to check the Farmer's Almanac to see how it's going to be this spring is complete garbage. There's a real crisis in Canada, and we're running out of time. So many homeowners have already seen their mortgages get bigger, not being paid down, but getting larger, because with interest rates going up to fight the inflation in the first place, their payments aren't even covering just the interest. So I know when it comes to groceries, I know Justin Trudeau's going to try to blame everybody else. But when Mr. Fergus talked about the increased input costs, one of those costs is the carbon tax, and that is continuing to rise. So Justin Trudeau, on the one hand, is raising taxes on the farmer who grows the food, the trucker who ships the food, and the grocer who sells the food, and then tries to blame other people in the industry and say that it's their fault. If we want to bring grocery prices down, we could start with scrapping the carbon tax that adds a great deal to those prices.
I'm just going to follow up with Mr. Scheer, because Mr. Scheer, I'm in no way is government spending not contributing to some degree to inflation? And the carbon tax in particular, assessed by the Bank of Canada to a wholesale impact on the rate of inflation of 0.15%. So they pause that carbon tax, as you advocate they do, and prices go down 0.1%. Is that really the relief that you think is adequate for Canadians?
The Bank of Canada was absolutely part of the problem, bankrolling Justin Trudeau's spending. We know that the carbon tax...
It's a policy of quantitative easing in order to spur...
And how did they do that?
Demand during a pandemic when it was completely depleted with respect.
40% of government spending during that time had nothing to do with the pandemic. So we have to park this idea that this was all
pandemic-related. But the government wasn't spending because the Bank of Canada handed them cash.
No. The Bank of Canada bought government bonds. At the time when Justin Trudeau was spending hundreds of billions of dollars more than he was taking in, the Bank of Canada underwrote that by creating brand new money. That's what causes inflation. When you have more dollars chasing fewer goods, you get inflation.
But that is pandemic programs at the time, which your party did.
As I said, 40% of that spending had nothing to do with COVID. That's from the Prime Minister's own parliamentary budget watchdog. That's not just me saying it. So we would have had way less inflation if the government had only focused on those measures that were necessary during the pandemic. Instead, we saw things like $35 billion to the Canada Infrastructure Bank, hundreds of millions of dollars in consultants' contracts to firms like McKinsey, $250 million going to the Asian Infrastructure Bank to help a communist regime in Beijing expand its influence by building the types of things that we can't get built here under Justin Trudeau. So there's lots of areas where the government directly caused a rise in prices. And again, if we want to start lowering grocery prices, we can start with lowering by scrapping the carbon tax that adds so much.
I want to make sure I get one
prices.
more round in for each of you. Mr. Fergus, the point that Mr. Scheer is making is that government spending has contributed. He says an outsized impact to inflation. I'll present to you an independent analysis from Scotiabank, which showed that government spending contributed at least 50 to 75 basis points of the interest rate hikes we're seeing. Does Mr. Scheer have a point that part of the problem with grocery prices are escalating input costs and that your government does have purview over some of those costs, for example, like the carbon tax, that you could press pause on? Why not consider that?
Well, let's take a look at that analysis. If you're saying about 50 to 75 basis points, which is 0.5 or 0.75%, 0.75%, or 0.75 of 1% is a problem. Well, we've seen interest, go from a high of 8.1%, 8.2% now down to 4%. So, I mean,
no,
I guess you could say
inflation. I'm talking about 50 basis points of interest rates.
So then the interest rates you've seen, gone from 2% or from the bank, the standard rate from the Bank of Canada from less than 1% to now 5%. So if that's only 0.75 at the top end of it, it's not. It's a lot of money for a mortgage. It's not nothing. But the important part is, but 4 times that amount came from what was happening around the world. So let's just understand what that means, and let's also understand that even if he agrees that they were in support of 60% of what we had chosen to spend money on to help Canadians Canadians and businesses get through the worst economic depression since in over 100 years.
What about the other 40%, though?
Well, the other 40% would represent about 0.6 cents on 0.06 cents on the inflation rate. So the whole point is that let's not get into numbers. Let's talk about helping people with really practical solutions. And some of the ways that we're trying to help with Canadians with practical solutions is making sure that they have affordable homes. We just saw an announcement where we were able to make sure that there are going to be 2,000 new units, affordable rental units in London, one city alone. Imagine what we can do over the country. Let's talk about what we're doing with helping 11 million Canadians.
But in that case,
the
numbers are important too. 2,000, the number of homes needed, according to the CMHC, is 5.8 million.
Well, or about 4 million over 10 years.
By 2030.
Exactly, over 10 years.
6 years. They say 5.8 million new homes by 2030.
So the whole point is that we have to start somewhere. This is a good start. It's a great market signal saying that there's going to be now more purpose-built rental housing that is affordable for Canadians and giving people an opportunity and giving them some hope. So we need hope, we need some hard work, and we need practical solutions, not slogans, not quick sound bites, not trying to blame a particular individual.
I'll give the last word to Mr. Scheer.
Let's all work together
to Mr. Ferguson's point, again, are you not overinflating the role the government has played in all this and therefore simplifying what the Conservative proposition is to eliminate the issues that Canadians are dealing with? If you wipe out the deficit, all of a sudden inflation is going to go down. That's not true.
It is absolutely true that when you bring in fiscal measures to be more prudent, to be more responsible, you will get easing on inflation. That is a fact.
But easing and wiping out are two different things.
Inflation is a monetary phenomenon. We've had wars in the past. We've had supply chain issues in the past. We've had challenges in the past. This was the first time in Canadian history where the Bank of Canada made a political decision to help the government of the day underwrite its spending. It created $600 billion of brand new money, not backed up by any new production or growth, and flooded that through the economy. The money supply in Canada shot up, and inflation shot right up with it. So the only way to end this crisis to bring that under control.
They are. There is a policy of quantitative tightening right now.
But the government is not. Chrystia Freeland herself, the finance minister herself, said that extra spending would add inflationary fuel to the fire. Former Liberal finance minister John Manley said that if you increase government spending while the Bank of Canada is raising interest rates, it's like stepping on the gas and the brake at the same time in the same car.
Just saying the
so
gas
it's
is
not just
flooded.
Conservatives. The gas is absolutely flooded, Vassy. You look at their last budget. After promising to take a path to more fiscal prudence, they blew the budget, added over $60 billion back into the spending machine, and now we have inflation up again. It's a direct correlation.
I have to leave it there. I'm sorry. I'm out of time. I tried very hard to give you equal time. I appreciate you both coming in for the discussion. I can guarantee it will be one that we have frequently over the coming weeks. Thank you to Greg Fergus and Andrew.